And for the gospel.
The Holy Gospel according to John.
Glory to you, O Lord.
And after this, Jesus went to the other side of the Sea of Galilee, also called the Sea of Tiberias. A large crowd kept following him because they saw the signs that he was doing for the sick. And Jesus went up the mountain and sat down there with his disciples. Now the Passover, the festival of the Jews, was near. When he looked up and saw a large crowd coming toward him, Jesus said to Philip, "Where are we to buy bread for these people to eat?" He said this to test him, for he himself knew what he was going to do. Philip answered him, 6 months' wages would not buy enough bread for each of them to get a little. One of his disciples, Andrew, Simon Peter's brother, said to him, "There is a boy here who has 5 barley loaves and 2 fish. But what are they among so many people?" Jesus said, "Make the people sit down." Now there was a great deal of grass in the place, so they sat down, about 5,000 in all. Then Jesus took the loaves, and when he had given thanks, he distributed them to those who were seated. So also the fish, as much as they wanted. When they were satisfied, he told his disciples, "Gather up the fragments left over, so that nothing may be lost." So they gathered them up, and from the fragments of the 5 barley loaves left by those who had eaten, they filled 12 baskets. When the people saw the sign that he had done, they began to say, "This is indeed the prophet who is to come into the world." When Jesus realized that they were about to come and take him by force to make him king, he withdrew again to the mountain by himself. When evening came, his disciples went down to the sea, got into a boat, and started across the sea to Capernaum. It was now dark, and Jesus had not yet come to them. The sea became rough because a strong wind was blowing. When they had rowed about 3 or 4 miles, they saw Jesus walking on the sea and coming near the boat, and they were terrified. But he said to them, "It is I. Do not be afraid." Then they wanted to take him into the boat, and immediately the boat reached the land toward which they were going. The Gospel of the Lord.
Praise to you, O Christ.
Please be seated. And if you'll please pray with me. Dear Lord, may the words of my mouth and the meditations of all of our hearts be good and acceptable to you. Amen. So what we see in every single one of today's readings is that there is an underlying theme, a binary of scarcity versus abundance. For example, in the first reading from 2 Kings, the servant focuses on what is lacking. This becomes the servant's point of anxiety and worry, his problem. The servant only has 20 loaves of barley and fresh ears of grain for 100 people. How can this be enough? But the prophet Elisha, a man of God, instead proclaims that they shall eat and have some left. Let them eat, he says. With Elisha, the focus is on the abundance. And then the psalm speaks of God who satisfies the desire of every living thing, whether in want or not. And in the Gospel of John, Philip cries out in momentary grief and despair that they would need 6 months' wages to buy enough food for all the people present. And Andrew only sees the limited number of supplies, only 5 loaves and 2 fish. But Jesus sees abundance. Similarly to the 2 Kings text, there are plenty of leftovers, 12 baskets of food to be exact. Let them eat. And finally, in our reading from Ephesians, on which we'll examine today a little bit, the writer focuses on what has been accomplished through Christ, on the abundance of a God who created the world and continues to create and recreate, on the abundance of a God who forgave and continues to forgive, a God who loved and continues to love. We often see scarcity when God is in fact abundant. We see only 5 loaves and 2 fish. We often see only a limited amount of resources. We place our own limits on our own generosity, on love, on our role as servants of Christ, as servants within the community as people of God. Our hatred and personal preferences can leave us stagnant. And what do I mean by that? What I mean is that we often only care for or love a person if that person is like us. And I don't mean throwing around the word love because we are Christians and saying I love you is what we're supposed to do. I mean really loving. I mean loving as an action word, love as a verb that moves us to act, that moves us to see our neighbor a little bit differently, that forces us to set aside our personal views in order to err on the side of inclusivity, that forces us to put others before ourselves as Christ did for us, that forces us to err on the side of the gospel of sacrifice and love. So how then do we see the abundance? How do we get to the point of understanding, of comprehending what is the breadth and length and height and depth of the love of Christ, of the fullness of God? How do we really utilize love as a verb? How do we embrace diversity instead of trying to fix it? How do we stop the cycle of pity when it comes to charity work and move towards a spirit of equality? How do we break down divisions in order that all people know that they are loved, cared for, and that they each have a voice? And I think I found part of the answer to these questions as I went with the youth to Detroit during the National Youth Gathering last week, with 30,000 high school youth from all over the United States, 400 of which came from the Southwestern Texas Synod, and 18 from right here at Zion. They swarmed the city of Detroit, a forgotten city, a city condemned by outsiders, a city where racial division is blatant and in your face, a city with a reputation of violence, a city where some people were afraid to send their children for a week of service, exploration, and worship. As we planned the trip, I wasn't sure what to expect. I was a little uneasy simply because I wondered if the work we were going to be doing in Detroit was sustainable. Was it about pity? Were we going there because we just felt bad for this city? Were we going to feed the system of charity instead of working towards long-term change? Were we simply going to feed the Detroit economy for a week and then leave it in the dust? These were truly honest concerns for me. And I learned it was a concern for many of our ELCA friends visiting Detroit that week. Yeah, sure, we fed the economy like crazy. And that's a cool thing. But there was a lot more going on in Detroit. I've never met so many people who cared for their city that deeply. People who were tired of the harsh words directed toward them and their city. People who lived in the city their entire lives and weren't about to give up on it. People who welcomed 30,000 crazy high school kids, who shared their stories with them and wanted to share their experience of the city. Going to Detroit was about hope. And it wasn't about us bringing them hope. It was about us witnessing the hope that was already there. It was about seeing the abundance of hope and God's presence in the city of Detroit. It was about seeing beyond the scarcity, beyond the lack of food and water and housing, beyond the harsh criticisms and the bad reputation, to God's abundance, the abundance of the hope and the love that's alive there. We were there to say that we're in this together. We were there to discover and witness to the height and the depth of God's love. We were there to witness to God's presence in the midst of every painful and joyful aspect of this world. We were there not so that we could speak on behalf of people, not so that we could have a day of service and then move on, but in order to speak with people, to learn their stories, to build relationships, if only temporary, to raise the voices of Detroit and to raise the voices of our youth. The reading from Ephesians today is a prayer for the people of that time, and it is a prayer for us today. The prayer is that as we live in community, as we speak with each other instead of for each other, as we bear one another's burdens, learn each other's stories, and come to see God present within each other, we come to understand what is the breadth and length and height and depth of our faith and our relationship with God. The author of Ephesians desires the community to be strengthened in order to comprehend this with all of the saints, the saint and yes sinner being me and you, the saint and sinner being the people of Detroit, the saint and sinner being our youth, our neighbors, our friends living on the street, our refugees seeking asylum, the saint and sinner being every person we meet. Seeing, understanding, and possibly comprehending the abundance of God's grace and God's love comes as we love and care for all people, the ones we consider friends and the ones who may be different than you or me. Seeing abundance comes as we live into fellowship as sinners and as saints, as we walk together, laying our lives in the arms of Christ and seeing each other through the abundance of God's love made known through Christ. So I guess the next question is, where do you see scarcity? And where do you see abundance? Do you see scarcity in San Antonio? What limits do you place on your own sense of love? And I ask this question because I didn't come up here today to talk all about Detroit. Detroit was just a place where I and many people were humbled. We didn't go to fix Detroit, but we are going to share in the hope the residents of Detroit have for their city. We are going to be witnesses to God's abundance. And now each of us has the opportunity to be witnesses to God's abundance here. We have the capability of utilizing love as a verb, as a movement, as an action, not letting love be scarce, not diminishing love's true purpose, but letting love move us into a place of fellowship and community as God's people. Therefore, I pray that according to the riches of God's glory, that God may grant that you be strengthened in your inner being with power through the Spirit, and that Christ may dwell in your hearts through faith as you are being rooted and grounded in love. I pray that you may have the power to comprehend with all the saints what is the breadth and the length and the height and the depth, and to know the love of Christ that surpasses all knowledge, so that you may be filled with all the fullness of God. Amen.